All right, here we are.
All right.
With another episode of Coffee with the Founder. Eddie Moore Jr. My pronouns are he, him. Today we're here with another outstanding colleague, friend, and true brother, Derrick Wheller-Smith. Brother Derrick, listen, we're doing these coffee talks just trying to introduce people in our WPC family and our WPC network to one another better. To let folks know about the good work folks are doing all across the nation. So we're glad you're here. We're going to get started by asking you, who are you? What do you do?
Dr. Moore, really appreciate the opportunity just to connect with you here in cyberspace as we're all adjusting and engaging in this new normal, these social media and platforms, and doing the best we can to continue to engage and to move our work forward. My name is Derrick Wheller-Smith. I live in Seattle, Washington, and I actually work for King County Public Health, and I lead our Zero Youth Detention work. Zero Youth Detention is really a strategic plan to improve community safety and was designed to achieve better outcomes for youth and families at risk of juvenile detention, legal system involvement. So it's absolutely a lofty goal, right? This idea of like, how do we get to zero youth detention? I would say that in some ways, the name in and of itself can be, for me at least, I grapple with the tension of it kind of in some ways being inherently racist, right? Because it's this idea of what do we have to do, or what's the work we need to do to not lock up Black and brown children, versus how do we shift the focus to how do we create the conditions that sets up young people to be happy, healthy, hopeful, safe, and thriving. And that by virtue of doing that, we'll find ourselves locking up fewer young people. And so ZYD in short, man, is really got 5 objectives: is to lead with race, to prevent young people from entering the system, to divert young people from further law enforcement and formal legal processes, and to support youth and families to reduce recurrence, right, of legal system involvement. And then the work ultimately of aligning and optimize the connections between systems that then would help us to be able to increase the effectiveness really around our work. And so that in a nutshell, man, is the work of Zero Youth Detention that I'm leading, and doing that through a public health approach.
Yeah, I appreciate that, bro. I was going to ask you, because I feel like most incarceration information is about adult imprisonment, prevention, so on and so forth. And you're on the ground with youth detention. Can you give us a sense of the landscape nationally, what it looks like when it comes to youth detention? And then also more specifically, what are some of the challenges you're dealing with there in the Pacific Northwest, the greater Seattle area?
Yeah, well, I think when you think about just the overall landscape, I think it's really a shift that's being made as there's, I would say, a large movement around decarcerating young people, right? Because we know through updated science, right, that incarceration actually causes more harm to young people, and that it's not a rehabilitative process, right? And that most often we're actually criminalizing kids and children for normal adolescent behavior. And so how do we then put and create the kind of conditions that sets up young people? How are we not making these broad sweeping policy changes that impacts hundreds of kids when at the end of the day, right, we're talking about maybe, 6 to 10 kids, right, in a community who actually maybe need to be isolated for a period of time because of public safety, right, and because maybe they're at risk to harming themselves or the public. And so I would say there's a large movement, man, across the country to decarcerate young people. And even in light of that, I think that we still have to contend with what do we mean when we say decarcerate. And I say that because electronic monitoring is something that has picked up. And so as we've watched the numbers begin to dwindle, what we're witnessing is a large increase in electronic monitoring, which is just another form of incarceration. And so we're watching the financial model shift because we're now moving towards digital prisons. And so we're just locking people up in their communities. We're watching financial models shift And if we're not careful about naming this and calling this out on the front end, in another 10 years, we're going to be dismantling e-incarceration. And so there's a lot of good work that's happening. I feel fortunate to be in King County. King County we're literally at like an all-time low. We have the lowest numbers to date for the data that just came out that we've ever had in the history of our county. And so, our average daily population in 98, man, was 200 young people. And in the first quarter of this year, our average daily population was 12 young people in juvenile detention. And so I think the big challenge with that is, while we've witnessed what I would say would be a precipitous decline in the incarceration of young people, there's been a steady increase in the disproportionality of the young people who are being locked up. And so conversation around how do we lead with race, and what does race have to do with it, and how can we be more intentionally ensuring that we disrupt and interrupt this school to prison pipeline. And in transparency, sometimes, man, I'm like, it doesn't feel like we're interrupting a school to prison pipeline. It feels like we're interrupting a business plan. That becomes a lot of the work that has to happen. And so we're talking about our country being one of the world's largest jailers, right? Who's invested $300 billion for the expansion of an industrial complex, while claiming we don't got money, man, for schools and for housing and for the homeless and feeding the poor and creating jobs with livable wages. And so I think we've got to really grapple and contend with some of the language that we use when we talk about opportunity and things like the American dream. Sometimes I wonder if it's easy for us to call it the American dream because you got to be asleep, I think, to believe that that's a reality for all folks. So,
yeah, I was going to ask you about some of what you've had some success with that you think can be applicable nationally. I'm sure there's some things that are specific to the Northwest in reference to success and some of the success y'all are experiencing. But are there some things that you've seen over your years doing this that you think any city, any state could begin to do this, and it could assist in creating those kinds of conditions that you're saying that are having a positive impact on your numbers?
Yeah, I think that the first thing has been the intentional partnership, honestly, around systems partners ultimately coming together, right? Because you don't get to this point, man, without having a prosecuting attorney, without having folks in Superior Court, without having folks in DAJD, and people who are at some level willing to make the kind of concessions that I think shifts us and helps us move forward in the work. But I also think that, there's a tendency, I think, for us to create and reach a level of kind of, I would say, comfort, right, with the work that we've done, and almost feel like we've arrived. And so I think it's a part of how do we apply the kind of intentional conversation that creates the kind of pressure where we're asking ourselves, similar to Tom Brady, man. I saw Brady, he had posted this, I think it was on Instagram or something, and he had put up like all of his rings, and the brother had, 6 fingers with the championship rings. And somebody in the comments said, Tom, what's your favorite one? And I love this because Tom said, you know what he said? He said, the next one. Like, wow, like how do we develop that kind of an appetite right in this work where we don't rest on our laurels, man, but it's really about how we're moving forward. But I think it's one, how can you bring folks together in a way, man, where you're developing a shared language, you're developing a shared analysis, because this work is deeply centered and rooted, as you know, in adult behavior change. And so how are we shifting and changing our mental models? How are we being intentional about naming what the values are in our work? Because our values should drive our behavior. And when behavior doesn't align with those values, man, we got to sit down and we got to have a courageous conversation. So that's been, I think, an important part of the work. But I also think that the biggest part of it is how are we authentically partnering with community, and how are we doing that in ways that doesn't look at and engage the community from a deficit-based model, that doesn't see the community or engage the community in ways that's tokenism or decoration, but looking at true community-based alternatives. The people who are closest to the problem are oftentimes the ones who are closest to the solution, right? And who ultimately can repair a spider's web? Nobody but the spider herself, right? And so we've got to be intentional about centering the voices of the people who have been most impacted. And those folks have to be at the table, and we have to lead after we center them from the wisdom of those people. And that's a shift, man. That's a shift for a system who's been showing up for a long time, I think. And most of our tendency is to look out the window more so than it is to look in the mirror. But if the people who are the closest to the problem are not at the table, the chances are they're on the menu. And so we got to be intentional about making sure that those folks have not just a seat at the table, but that they are integral in helping to lead the work. And so we've been intentional about leveraging resources that are connected to community-based alternatives that are created by the community, right? And that aren't created by the system, and then be able to support the community to be able to house and to be able to hold and to be able to support in creating the kind of structures that makes that work sustainable.
Yeah, you had mentioned earlier what's race got to do with it, and I really appreciate that. However, sometimes I find that when people hear that, they're thinking often it's the lens of people of color. And I do think that that's an important piece to look at, you know, those, as you mentioned, disproportionately incarcerated, the communities in which they come from. But I don't often find that when people talk about race, white supremacy, whiteness, white people are part of that conversation. Can you talk a little bit about what's your white supremacy, incarceration, youth incarceration, the legal side, the policing side? I'm just wondering, when I say to you, what's race got to do with it? Can you talk about white supremacy as a part of that conversation?
Woo, man, brother, that's a that's a loaded question. So I think that the reality is that our humanity has been under suspicion, you know, and I think that that is critical to the backdrop to understand the unfolding and I would say evolving perception of Black people in America. You know, our humanity has been questioned, our intelligence has been questioned. And so we have to remember that under slavery, Black lives were considered only a fraction of a human life. And so this prevailing way of valuing lives assumed that some lives mattered more. Some lives were more human, more worthy, more deserving of life and freedom, where freedom meant minimally just the freedom to move and thrive without being subjected to coercive force, you know? And so I think when we hear that statement, and I know that it carries kind of some of this like political animus for some folks, particularly some of my white brothers, our white brothers and sisters, this idea of like Black Lives Matter, right? And it's like, really, it's a statement of outrage, and it's just simply a demand for equality, right? For the right to live free of constraint. But also, I think it's a link to a history of slavery, of debt peonage, of segregation, and a prison system that I would say is geared towards the confinement, neutralization, and degradation of Black lives. But as you mentioned, also a police system that more and more easily can often take away a Black life in a flash, all because some officer perceives a threat, you know? And so I know that there are people who respond, right? And I think that it's this notion of like, well, why do we have to lead there? And when we just want to center the conversation on Black folks and Black lives, don't all lives matter? And it's like, well, yeah, it is true that all lives matter, but it is also equally true that not all lives are understood to matter, which is why it's precisely important for us to name the lives of those that have not mattered and are struggling to matter in a way that they deserve. And when we look at the historical context and the lived experience of folks in in this country, as it relates to Black people and Black bodies, we have to contend and we have to grapple with the fact that Black lives, man, historically have not mattered and continue today to not matter when we look across all of these systems, right? And things that have happened that have been perpetuated by these realities. I mean, we could take something just as simple as redlining, right? And its impact. And folks who, people didn't trip and fall into ghettos and poor communities, and people didn't trip and fall into barrios, right? Like, no, that was a social construct of the government. And now we're at a point today where through public health data, your zip code is a larger predictor of your mortality rate than your DNA.
Mm. Mm. Yeah, I appreciate that, man. That's it. Because I think knowing and having people know that when we say race is an important part of this conversation, that's a comprehensive racial conversation. And I'm so frustrated, bro, because I feel like everybody talks about those folks who are on the bottom of the formula, which I think is important. We understand that. But think about that systemic design that places folks on the top and keeps rising them above by systemic contribution, systemic design. And if we don't simultaneously look at that, we're going to be doing our work here, but still allowing some of that to function there. What's your sense of how the criminal justice system is doing? I mean, you're in the throes of it, particularly from a youth dynamic. If you had to assess this system's life over time, what's your sense of how that system's doing?
I think that, I mentioned to you before about how I think one of the things that I've grappled with and wrestled with is there are all of these things ultimately that we said that we didn't have capacity, man, to do. And I think if there is something that I would say that COVID has been helpful in assisting us with or shifting for us, I think it's revealed to us, or at least is reminding us, like how much of contemporary American life is rife with these power structures that are built on punishment and fear, as opposed to what's really in our best interest. And I'm watching like how many of these things we said, man, weren't possible, right? And we said that some of this stuff wasn't possible because, we don't have the finances for it, or it would upset the way that we have always done things. It's too expensive, whatever, right? And so we're watching stores allowing seniors shop earlier. We're watching, young people being able to learn online. 1,900 spaces were created here for individuals, man, experiencing homelessness. We're watching jails reduce the number of people, man, who are incarcerated, right? And doing some of these release policies around things that they're going, this person doesn't really need to be locked up over this, right? Like this person can go home and come back later and we can be having a conversation around what this process needs to look like to hold them accountable for their behavior, right? And so I think I'm grappling with like, will we continue to be more humane in our approach as we think about the fact that for a lot of Americans, man, a return to normal is a scary idea. Mm. And I think that what I've been grappling with is like when we start to follow the money, which is why I'm like, are we interrupting a school to prison pipeline, or are we really interrupting a business plan? Because when you start following the money, man, that's when all kind of stuff starts to surface. You know what I mean? And starts to pop up. I mean, I mentioned to you like, all the challenges right around just electronic monitoring and these digital prisons. I mean, BI Incorporated, right? So it's the largest electronic monitoring company in the country. So they're a subsidiary of the GEO Group, which is the largest private prison company in the world. And so there's this connection where we just want to shift people out of prison and into incarceration. And they're just trying to grow their market while keeping people in prison. So all this ensures is that they continue to get paid. And so we have to look at state-sanctioned violence, period, and mass incarceration. And we have to have a conversation around what has led to this demand for incarceration. And we have to start contending with what does decarceration actually look like? And what is the fundamental mental model shift that we have to make in how we respond to harm And how do we maintain public safety in this demand to decarcerate in our evolving criminal justice system while we're using technology that wants to create digital prisons that we're going to have to contend with years down the line, right, when this becomes an official crisis. And so we have to move in a direction that advances more dignity and freedom for people who are oftentimes victims of mass incarceration. And we can't look at some of these other forms. And I think that there's an opportunity, I guess I'll say, for us to just take a pause and think about, if we end some of these monetary bails, how do we actually address harm and maintain public safety in our communities? Or do we just want to find technological solutions to these issues that we have an opportunity right now in front of us to course correct?
Yeah. Wow. I'm so happy that you dropped knowledge around this incarceration, this electronic plan, this expansion of the business plan, so to speak, because I know for myself that's something I haven't been so in tune to, that I'm hoping some of the folks listening and watching will now open their eyes even a little wider. Now, ZYD, I think we could say, is one of the most pioneering programs across the nation. And I want to give you some major props for that. But what I'm wondering is this where you thought you would be? And did you grow up thinking, I want to be leading one of the top youth-oriented programs in the nation? How did you get here? How did you get to this point, bro?
Yeah, no, I definitely didn't. That wasn't really the plan. I think that the seed is powerful, right? And so the seed always wins. And I'm saying that just because, historically, my grandfather was the first Black probation officer in the state of Washington, wow. Right? He graduated from University of Washington in 1951, man, Arthur Wheeler. My father later worked for the prosecuting attorney's office, right, as a result of the relationship that my grandfather had developed. And my father worked under the first prosecuting attorney, Chris Bailey, and was an integral part in helping to galvanize some of the police and community relationships that were going on. One particular story that's told about the Black Panthers, there was a shop in the neighborhood that actually sold drugs through these sandwiches. So based on the sandwich you ordered, they knew what drugs to put in there. Black Panther Party wasn't having it, bruh. So, them brothers is across the street, man, with AK-47s. They lined up 20 deep. Like, look, you ain't going to be doing this, not in our community. Yeah. And so my dad ends up going down there because shortly after the Panthers show up, it's 40 police officers across the street with their guns drawn, And so Pops literally was a bridge in that conversation to go over to Aaron Dixon and the Panthers and go, look, y'all, as long as you keep them guns in the air, you good. And then go back across the street to the police and like, hey, look, as long as they got their guns in the air, there doesn't need to be a problem here, And so I bring up that conversation around the seed always wins because I absolutely did not plan to be in this space. I think what I've always done and what has been the experience of my life in terms of, 25 years of a body of work is that I've woke up every day, man, with child well-being on my mind and with how do we center the voice of those who are most impacted and the folks who are disproportionately marginalized. And how do we look at what are the social determinants of health, right, that are impacting those folks? Because I think part of what the racist system would have us do is to continue to fund programs that only address the symptoms and not the cure. And we have to develop the kind of analysis that moves us away from just funding programs to asking how do we get the institution itself to show up differently and to not look out the window, but to look in the mirror and go, wait a minute, we've created institutional harm and there's no way to solve for all of these disparities unless we acknowledge the interdependence across all these domains. And so we have to come together collectively to go, how are we aligned and optimizing together to look at the ways that we have to change the social determinants of health? Otherwise, our analysis tells us that as a system, we can fund these folks to show up and wipe the snot from the community's nose. And the problem is that our analysis isn't deep enough to understand that the community has pneumonia. So while we walk away feeling like the community is better because we wipe the community's nose, the community continues to die. Because we don't want to take the type of analysis that says it's not just good enough for us to take our quantitative data, but we got to look at qualitative data, we got to look at historical data, and we've got to be able to tie those things together, because if we're not having a conversation about the historical data, then we're left, if we can't draw a line from history and historical data to where we're at now, then we're left with a deep sense of victim blaming, right? And it's those people who need to do better, and they need to pull themselves up by their bootstraps, and they. And we don't take responsibility for the conditions that have been created. And we talk about those communities and we'll say, man, look at those folks. It's just sad. It's like crabs in a bucket.
Yeah.
But we never have to have the conversation to go, guess what? Crabs don't grow up in buckets.
Yeah.
That is the natural habitat of the crab.
Yeah.
Not the natural habitat of these people who are growing up in these conditions that were not created by them, but they've had to find ways to try to survive and thrive under adverse circumstances, right? And so we can't continue to fund programs that tries to do work with kids that sends them back into the very environment that made them sick in the first place.
Yeah. I mean, you raise a good point, because I think if COVID has shown us anything, is this willingness to build this narrative that it's their fault. What I'm wondering from you, though, I feel like COVID-19, quarantine, shelter in place has really, at least for some, I'm not sure if you've been kind of in the essential worker space, being in the position you're in, but I think to some extent it's slowed us all down to really kind of do some introspection, some looking inward as a nation, as a city, as a community. But I'm wondering for you, Brother Derrick, I mean, what has this time done for you? What has it had you thinking about as you look at the work you've been doing for 20 plus years and the work ahead of you?
Yeah, I think that many of these shifts have in some ways caused us to slow down enough to be reflective. And I think that the system is designed in such a way that it's moving at such a rapid pace that most often we're responding. And so we find ourselves disconsciously going from thinking to doing, because we're not allowed to slow down enough to go, wait a minute, like, what do I feel about what's happening right now and about what's going on? And that's a much deeper conversation just around, if we were to just talk about our beloved brother and his seminal work, Dr. Edwin Nicholson, around the philosophical aspects of cultural difference, and just the way our capacity for people of color and the way that we intuitively, right, experience things, and that the ability to actually be able to slow down enough to feel, right, what's happening and what's going on, and the way that that impacts how we move through the world. I've actually found it to be much more of a healthier space. I think what it's allowed me to do work that I've already been doing intentionally with my team, but to take that a step deeper, to go, how do we build shared humanity by bridging across differences so that we create systems and structures of belonging? Because sometimes I think we have these conversations about like power, right? And it's like this loss of, and it's like, no, this is really about how do we create systems and structures of belonging? How do we recognize and see it that, yes, all perspectives are valid, but all perspectives are partial. And not until we normalize this space that creates an opportunity for multiple perspectives to be heard and to move away from these dominant narratives and perspectives that have been driving everything, that we're going to continue to perpetuate some of the very same things that we've done, because we can't even create the kind of internal structure and systems that allows each other to show up in ways that are more humane. And so it's been little things that are simple, but I think mean everything, right? And so I've been intentional about, you know, when some of this stuff first happened, man, I'd have my kids come in and my daughter sit on my lap, right, while I'm having a Zoom call. Because I knew that just like I was struggling with what does this look like and what does this mean, other folks were struggling with that same question too and trying to answer that. And what Supremacy has taught us is that we have to show up in perfection. Right? And we have to leave all of that stuff. And we kind of talked a little bit about that at the beginning, right? Like, you know, we've been socialized not to show emotion or not to, right? And so it's really, I think, an opportunity to be more humane, man. And to really ask ourselves as we center the people who have been most vulnerable to grapple with when this is over, man, will we go back to these gouging rules and to numbly looking the other way at crises that are in plain view? Because we've got such a rapid pace that we just move on and we become desensitized to it. And what slowing down has allowed us to do, I think, is to be more present, and particularly to be more present in a space where we got to be honest, man. Like COVID-19 came along, and it neutralized everybody. It stripped folks of their power. It stripped us of these power that created these policies and practices and structures and stuff that we said couldn't be changed. But yet here we are, right? And so what is the way forward? What do we have to do to not go back? What does it mean for us to create more humane spaces and more spaces of belonging that allows each other to bring our full humanity into the space? Because if we can't do that, I think we're in denial about being able to do that work with community in ways that allows community to bring its full humanity into the space, where we're not saying we need you to engage with us in ways that comforts the fragility of a white supremacist system, right? But you can show up in all of your authenticity, and we're not afraid of that because we're not afraid of the change that's going to come as a result of our commitment to being different, so that we can move away just from the language and these words that we use. And how do we create a container in that space of belonging where we don't turn up the heat so high, man, that folks just completely disengage, but it also can't be so low, man, that there's no discomfort. Right. Because if there's no comfort, we ain't changing. We're going to keep doing what we've been doing, right? Because we've been programmed. And for some of us, I think we've just been in these institutions, at least, you know, when I think about the institutionalized work that I'm engaged in, I recognize that too often we've been in these institutions so long that we find ourselves advocating more for the institution than we do for the people that we're called to serve. And I think it's moments like what we've experienced in COVID-19 that slows us all down and causes us to really re-examine our why, you know, and to ask, what does this mean for my commitment to this work? And how do we carry this forward in ways that makes the people that we're called to serve better?
Bro, I gotta get ready to let you go, but I want to ask you, what's on the horizon the next 10 years? Where do you see yourself? Mayor, governor? I mean, what are you thinking about over these next 10 years when you look at Derrick Wheller-Smith in the 10-year plan?
Man, that's a great question. I think, you know, to be honest with you, you know, you had mentioned, like, what have you done? And I think I've been engaged in so many spaces, man. I've been an educator, right, as a teacher. I've been an administrator in schools. I've worked out of the district office. I've led PBIS teams. I've led restorative work in schools. I've worked in homelessness. I worked in the Division of Developmental Disabilities for 4 years, right? And so in all of these spaces, it's literally, as I mentioned, been about centering the work of those who have been most impacted. And I feel like a lot of that has led me literally, man, across this entire school to prison pipeline where I've engaged really at kind of these different sectors. And I feel like it's all prepared me for this moment. And I think that what I have been always content to do is to really focus on the current assignment, man, that I've been given, and to pour myself, you know, into that, because I think that there's been a balance for me, and I you know, I don't put this on anybody else. I just feel like this is how I feel like God has always dealt with me, right? It's like, follow the orders that I've given you, walk this out, and it'll be very clear, like, what the next thing is that I'm supposed to be engaged in or what I'm doing. And I think that that's held me in a way, man, where I've been able to be as authentic as I can in leading this work, because I think that the danger for me in leading this work as a Black man is always this struggle with this level of exceptionalism that I experience in these different opportunities, right? And I think white supremacy wants to dangle some of those carrots. And when white supremacy can begin to dangle those carrots, and it's about what my next opportunity is or what, right, then I lose focus about what my commitment is to serve in the space that I'm in. And I also know that when you show up in ways that are authentic, right, that sometimes you only have a really short window, man, because folks don't want you around pushing too hard, right, on some of these things. And so I really don't have personally any aspirations to go into politics. It just feels like, man, such a dirty game, to be honest with you. And I know that politics is involved in everything, you know, that we participate in. But whatever it is, I'm sure it'll be centered around liberation, man. You know, it'll be centered around liberation, man, and the liberation of Black and brown bodies, man. And I'll be continuing to fight, man, until we're free. And maybe that'll be something that I won't get to experience in my lifetime. But I'm reminded, man, of folks who over in Europe spent 240 years, 250 years building those beautiful cathedrals. And they were engaged in building cathedrals that they would never get the opportunity to step foot in or to be able to see. But yet they were so committed, right, to the vision of that work. And I think that's what I want to give myself and my life to. And so whatever it is, it'll be something, man, that's connected to that.
Yeah, well, bro, I've always, in my time in Seattle, appreciated you supporting me, man, showing love for me and my work. And I'm so glad that we can introduce folks to you and the powerful work you're doing. And just know, wherever the White Privilege Conference is, if you can get there, you're always invited.
Awesome. Yeah. No, we appreciate you, man. Appreciate the tremendous work that you have been engaged in over the years, and continue to have a significant impact across the country. So, man, we're proud of you. We love you. And I always appreciate the opportunity to share space with you. I feel like we connect more in like other parts of the country in Seattle. But nevertheless, man, it's always a delight, man, to share space with you. And we appreciate you, man. And in these difficult and challenging times, man, you know, we pray your strength and appreciate you, man. So continue to shine and keep up the tremendous work.
Man, I'm going to do that, man. I'm going to ask you to make some tough selections, man. Just one choice out of the two choices I give you real quickly, all right?
Okay.
So we can end in a fun way, all right? A little laughter to take us out. All right, so here you go.
There we go.
Your choices. Macklemore or Sir Mix-a-Lot?
Sir Mix.
Cardi B, Nicki Minaj?
Ooh. Dang, that's a tough one. I think I'm gonna go with Nicki, man. Nicki's bars are a little bit Nicki's tough with the bars.
Okay, you going with Sue Bird or Candace Parker?
I gotta go with Candace, man. More versatility.
You going with Bron or Jordan?
MJ, man. MJ got a killer streak, man. That Bron just, you know, he couldn't. Hey, he's a beast. I ain't taking nothing away from Bron, but Bron don't got that. He don't got that killer instinct, man. He don't got that eye of the tiger that Mike had.
I ain't got enough time. I ain't got no time to process that right now. I'm gonna go to my next one. Tupac or Biggie?
Pac, man. I'm West Coast.
Okay. Netflix or Hulu?
Netflix.
All right. The Wire or New Jack City?
The Wire, man. The Wire did a better job unpacking the whole story, man.
Will Smith or Denzel?
Ooh. Man, that's tough. I'm going to go with Will.
You going with Spike Lee or Tyler Perry?
Spike.
Kerry Washington, Viola Davis?
Viola.
Whitney, Tina?
Ooh. I got to go with Whitney, the voice, man.
Beyonce or Janet?
Man, you picked some tough ones. I got to go with B.
You going with Steve Harvey or Richard Pryor?
I got to go with Richie Rich.
Justin Bieber or Justin Timberlake?
Bieber.
NWA, Public Enemy?
Ooh, I got to go with Public Enemy, man. Both were impacts on the culture. I got to go with PE.
Taylor Swift or Lady Gaga?
I'm going to go with Lady Gaga.
Listen, you got one song to sing for your lip sync or karaoke championship. What's the song you going with?
If it was a song, for karaoke championship, it's the joint by Music Soul Child. Love, something I've got to tell you, but I'm afraid I don't know how. Yes, sir.
Boy, you got my vote, man. You got my vote, man. Listen, bro, man, I'm sending you love, man. Wakanda from a distance, man. Appreciate you, like, man. Be safe out there, man, and keep up the great work, and let's stay in touch. And when I get to Seattle, we got to do something because we can't be doing it out of town anymore.
Let's make it happen. Now, when we was in, where was that at? We were in New Orleans together the last time I was with you, and you told my wife and I we were going to connect. So we're going to hold you accountable to it. We'll see you next year.
That's a done deal. That's a done deal.
All right. Dinner on us.
I appreciate you, bro.
All right. Take care, man. Peace and love.